What's up, it's your boy Big Jay Oakerson on why affirmative action is actually kinda good, and why Dave Smith is wrong about it. Let me clarify that Dave Smith is not wrong about Africa by Toto being the greatest song ever made. If you don't know Big Jay Oakerson and Dave Smith, they are 2/3 of the Legion of Skanks. The other one being Louis J. Gomez, the diversity hire. Now before I start, my script is not funny enough to do Big Jay Oakerson justice, but hey, I already wrote it, so I'm not gonna make any changes. But I have to admit, in hindsight, this video probably should have been titled Your Boy Louis Gomez on why affirmative action is actually kinda good, and why Dave Smith is wrong about it. Also, I watched a lot of Jay's stand-up to work into this video, which was very difficult. His stand-up is not that intellectual. So be prepared, I guess? If you don't know what affirmative action is, Google defines it as the practice or policy of favoring individuals belonging to groups regarded as disadvantaged or subject to discrimination. Positive discrimination. In America, this is mostly based on race. Affirmative action has come into the news because the Supreme Court has recently decided it is illegal. So let's discuss why the Supreme Court and Dave Smith, who agrees with this decision, are both wrong. So first of all, there is this argument that it should be a pure meritocracy and that we should only look at the grades. But this is ridiculous. We all know grades don't accurately reflect the actual intelligence or even effectiveness of a student. The problem is that we know testing, especially standardized ones, are not a good way to measure competence and intelligence. What do I mean by this? Well, let me explain the reasoning behind the previous statement. Let's look at the Dutch education system for an example. The Dutch education system is filled with standardized testing. Every year, all the last year students of every single primary school in the country take a standardized test to determine the level of education that student will follow. In the Netherlands, high school is divided in levels, so the less academically gifted students get their education at lower levels of difficulty than the more academically gifted, or that is at least a theory. But out of several reports about the Dutch education system, we now know that 40% of all highly intelligent Dutch high school students are at the lowest level. So in actuality, these standardized tests assign at least 40% of the most intelligent Dutch students completely wrong. It is also completely impossible to design a standardized test that measures abstract concepts that are very important for a job or education, like creativity, ability to work in a team, or critical thinking. This makes the idea that you just let the person with the highest grade in your prestigious educational establishment kinda unfair. You need to look at all the qualities and struggles they had to endure. Let's look at two fictional students for an example. Student 1 scores in the top 1% of the nation, while student 2 has scores which put them in the top 25% of the nation. You might say you obviously pick student 1, but what if the 1% student literally went to the best high school in the United States, the Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. He also grew up in the best neighborhood in Alexandria, which is already the best city to live in Virginia, with his parents being both hyper successful and still happily married, which is why he also had access to a private tutor to help him achieve his educational goals. While student 2 went to the worst school in the United States, Vision Academy School in Monroe, Louisiana, grew up in Monroe, a city with one of the worst crime rates in the United States, in a single parent household with 5 other siblings who all live below the poverty line. In this case, I think that student 2 is actually the more impressive student. My point with this example is that just because someone might have a lower score doesn't mean they are less capable. Having said this, if there are any college administrators watching this video, please remember that when my daughter, Big Jay Oakerson's daughter, sends you an application letter, being Big Jay Oakerson's daughter is basically the same thing as growing up in Monroe, just with more Puerto Ricans. Now, having established that there isn't a real meritocracy anyway, why is affirmative action a good thing? Well, to start this segment, let's look at one of Dave Smith's biggest anti-affirmative action arguments.
Justice Roberts pointed this out in his decision, that he said the justices dissenting here would absolutely find this illegal if it were being done to blacks or Hispanics.
This is a fair argument. Most of these people would call it racist. if this was happening to black and Hispanic people, but that doesn't mean it is. I actually think that in some cases we do need to bring diversity in places where minorities are overrepresented. Why? Let me explain, whilst arguing another one of Dave's points. Another argument Dave Smith makes is that we should find out why black kids underachieve in academics instead of focusing on affirmative action.
The answer can't be to have a policy where these black kids who are less qualified get preferential treatment. Then what could the answer be? Well, to get their SAT scores up, to get their grades up, right? But you already see where now you'd actually have to get into solving the root of the problem.
Well, first of all, black boys underachieve way more in America than black girls. So let's take race out of the question and see why boys in general underachieve more than girls. What if one of the reasons why they underachieve is because they are underrepresented in schooling? Because you all know that men are highly underrepresented in schooling. Let me give you a personal example. You might think your boy Big Jay Oakerson is a comedian who watches his friends have sex from windows. But I'm also studying to help vulnerable kids at school in the Netherlands. So why is this important? Well, I'm the only straight guy in my class. So this means when I graduate, I am the only one of my class who will have the lived experience of 45% of these kids. This is an example of how men are underrepresented in education. Mix this with the fact that a way higher percentage of boys go down in that level of education than girls, it's quite clear that the divide between boys and girls is getting bigger. This decline with how boys perform in schools is in strong correlation with the decline of male teachers. And this is not just a Dutch problem. You can also see this happening in the American education system and the British education system. Basically, this is why diversity is so important. You have to make sure there is diversity in any given field because you want the experience of all people being taken into account. To come back to my point about education, this doesn't just apply to boys, but black people in general are also heavily underrepresented in the education system, which means in large their experience is not taken into account at all. Another argument Dave makes is that when his kid was sick, he wanted the best doctor to treat his child, and his race was irrelevant.
A surgeon performed open heart surgery on my 3-day-old son. There was nothing I cared about aside from that he was the best surgeon. Literally nothing else could matter. The idea that his race would even come into play,
which is of course true and completely understandable. You do want the best people to do the most difficult jobs, but again, when it comes to how decisions get made in an industry, you do want every single perspective being heard. In this clip, Dave Smith's co-host Robbie the Fire actually makes kind of a good argument for affirmative action whilst trying to belittle it.
You know, the idea of you need diverse opinions. I'm just formulating. It's like if you had a bridge and you had a bunch of engineers and they're taking a look at the bridge and they're like, hey, listen, before we can certify this, we need a blind guy to look at it. We need a diverse range of opinions. So until the blind guy looks at this thing.
This might sound ridiculous, but yes, you should have a blind person go over the plans to make a bridge. So it can be taken into consideration how to make that bridge more accessible for everyone, including blind people. My point is that if you want representative decisions to be made in your society, you need to make sure that the people making those decisions are diverse enough to represent that society, especially when you're talking about areas where the entirety of society has to deal with that sector. This is why to me the sports argument that keeps being given doesn't make sense.
Sports is the clearest example. Imagine if they dictated that you have to have a certain amount of white people on your team. And you've got someone who's clearly a much better basketball player, and now you have to field a worse team because it's been mandated that you need to have a Jew on your team. How many Jews are in the NBA right now? Imagine if they mandated that every team needed to have some whiny Jew and that you needed to give him time on the court, right? We can all see why that makes no sense.
Most people will never play any NBA player, nor are they made to, but your son has to go to school, in which case it matters that someone can relate with him. And this is even more important when it comes to leadership positions, where people make decisions that impact the entire society. A good example of this actually happening is that when COVID happened, the evidence of vitamin D deficiency being a risk factor when contracting COVID got completely ignored by the medical establishment and the White House COVID team led by Dr. Fauci. I'm not saying that affirmative action could have solved this, but to me it was obvious that black people, who have a higher risk of being vitamin D deficient, were not being taken into consideration by the mostly upper class and non-black COVID response team. This is why affirmative action at Ivy League schools is so important, because let's not kid ourselves, most of America's future leaders will come from an Ivy League school. This is why I'm not only pro-affirmative action when it comes to race, but also socio-economic background. Like Dave says, reacting to this clip of this woman talking about affirmative action.
Diversify without taking race into account. What are you diversifying? You're diversifying, people's income.
It's also just so funny to go like, well, if we're not looking at race, what would we look at for diversity? And then she throws out income and you're like, yeah, okay. That is another factor, absolutely.
I do agree that we should also make sure affirmative action gets done based on the household income of a student. So this was my reasoning behind why affirmative action is actually kind of good and why Dave Smith is wrong about it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any feedback, please let me know in the comments of this video. This was your boy Big Jay Oakerson. See you later.